We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to Aboriginal elders emerging. Hello friends. Couple of quick updates. First thing is little Mary did not come home the other night, but then she did. And I thought, okay, it's netting. It has to be netting. And so I found another guy. So I think we're going to go netting. Thank you so much to everybody who sent all the suggestions about how to keep my naughty cat inside or inside my yard, and even the people who offered to come over and build me cat runs, and even the people who thought I'm a complete idiot and said, why don't you just keep her inside? Yeah, like I get it, but, you know, like I live with kids and old people. Doesn't really work that way. Shut the door, mate. Doesn't really work, does it? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I know, you're always sorry. Everyone's always sorry. Anyway, Louisa James, thank you so much for becoming a patron. Oi, the other news is, for those of you who are in Melbourne, I'm so sorry it's always Melbourne, but it's not for much longer, promise. Sandra Pankhurst, beautiful, beautiful Sandra Pankhurst, also known as the Trauma Cleaner, is going to be on stage with Emily and I shortly in the month of November at St Kilda Town Hall. Go to our Facebook page to the events bit and find out how you can get tickets to that. But I promise you, very early next year, I am on the road, baby, and coming to somewhere near you with some true crime. Andrea, Vanessa Gray, Sophie McCracken, Astrid Lingard. Oh, you sound like a detective in a Nordic noir novel. I must read another Nordic noir novel. I love them and I haven't read one in ages. For those of you who are new to the podcast and thinking, why does she say names at the start? These are patrons. I've forgotten to tell you that for ages, haven't I? Patrons, patreon.com/Ost True Crime Pod, AUST, True Crime Pod. You can go there and become a patron for $5 or $2 and get extra stuff every month and keep me in the manner to which I've become accustomed, which is, you know, up and down. But I'm very grateful. Jetta Ford. Oh, I love that. Jetta. Are you named after the classic film? Tom Hunter. Caroline Hall. I've got actually Carolyn. You're Carolyn, because I have a friend called Caroline, Line, and she gets the shits when people call her Carolyn. Like, how can you tell? Anyway. Kumpsia, you're back. Yeah, this list is a bit touch and go, isn't it? Because some people say, why haven't you said my name? But I swear to God, I say some names 4 times. Kumpsia, hi again. Lisa Lusted. Good name. Michelle Bowes. Lucy Dyson. Linda Sullings. Beck Webb. Jane Winson, Maya George, or is it Maya? I've got a cat called Maya, and I know I've said that before. Ali, Sally Evans, Kayleen Donnelly, Karen, Rebecca Waring, Jane, Fee Townsend, because this is really my job now, and I'm very grateful for that. Very, very so grateful that this is my job. What a wonderful job it is too, to be helping people tell their stories and to have the best listeners ever in the world and to never have to talk about The Bachelor. Ooh, I love it. Leah Heinrich. Sue Frew. Shut up. Your name is not Sue Frew. And if it is, I love it. Did you marry Mr. Frew? Surely your parents didn't call you Sue Frew, which is fine if they did. And they're great. Either way. Jen Carmen. Renee Smith. Madison. Just Madison. I'm assuming you're an escort. Penelope McDonald. Luke Thomas. Because the only people I know who call just Madison are just $200 an hour. Luke Thomas. Oh, my, 200. That's a long time ago. It's probably more now. Nicole Mui. Kerry Lappin. Sarah Purvis. Jamie Hall. Jordan Wishart. Tracy Goff. Claire Mundy. Rachel Rampling. Mel Burkhart. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for your patronage. Okay, on with the show. The following podcast contains content of a graphic, violent nature and is not suitable for children.
Over the last almost 12 years now, I've had to travel back to Bulgaria to see Jock, probably for over 40 times. Jock has learnt to cope with the prison system. Every single day, Jock has had to fight for something. It might be food, it might be clothing, it might be for a privilege or against a punishment. And over that time, I've seen Jock grow into a stronger person.
An Australian man detained for 11 years in Bulgaria has been granted parole by a panel of judges.
When I woke up that morning and I actually saw that Jock had been released from prison and had been granted parole, it was a fantastic moment. It was a decision that could not be appealed. We even started planning how to bring him home and where he would stay.
Unfortunately, it did prove to be a short-lived feeling of relief, because it wasn't long after that things really started to spiral again out of control. There were all the familiar problems that we'd experienced before with the justice system and being subject to interference by politicians and powerful people within Bulgaria.
That's Dr. Simon Palfreeman from Newcastle and his wife Helen, speaking to ABC's Australian Story about his son Jock, who's now in his early 30s, but who was a teenager when he decided university wasn't for him, and instead he'd go travelling. Many young Australians head to Europe in search of adventure, of course, but frankly, few of us have Jock's imagination when it comes to where to look for it. I have to say, Bulgaria isn't a destination I've ever considered when making up an itinerary. I've certainly never considered spending months on end there, and most travellers don't respond to the looming end of their visa by joining the British Army. But Jock Palfreeman is anything but your usual traveller.
This is Australian True Crime with Michelle Laurie and Emily Webb. Come with us as we go beyond the news cycle to find out how people become killers, how people become victims, and what happens next.
There's a link to the episode of Australian Story chronicling Jock's misadventure in Bulgaria in the show notes and on our Facebook page. And the producer of the episode, Belinda Hawkins, joins us today. She's been reporting on the story since it first unfolded in 2007, and she's gotten to know Jock and his family here in Australia pretty well. They even entrusted her to write their story in a book called Every Parent's Nightmare. We started our conversation by asking Belinda how it was that Jock Palfreeman, the confident, outspoken, well-educated son of professionals from Newcastle, Australia, came to be convicted of the murder of Andrei Monov, the confident, outspoken, well-educated son of professionals from Sofia, Bulgaria.
Jock was going to be having Christmas with his aunt, who lives out of London, made a toss-of-the-coin decision, literally a toss-of-the-coin decision, to fly back to Bulgaria to catch up with friends for the couple of weeks he had off in 2007 with an English friend of his who had a place in a village in the mountains and an English woman who was their mate. The three of them spent Christmas sledding, laughing, having a few drinks. Jock went and visited the friends in a nearby town whom he'd met when he lived there for some 5 months. So he caught up with old friends. Things were all going well. He didn't really like going into the capital city. He'd seen bad things happen there. He was much happier, much more content in the mountains. But on the December 27th, his English mate said, "Come on, let's go into Sofia for the female friends last night. Let's go and have a few drinks in the capital city." Jock was like, no, I don't really want to do that. And then he said yes. And they had a hire car out the front of the place they were staying. They were all in the hire car. And suddenly Jock remembered he didn't have his identity papers on. He rushed inside, grabbed whatever it was, a passport or an ID card, and next to it was his mate's butterfly knife. and he pocketed it. And off they went. They went to a bar in the centre of the city and were there for quite a few hours. And Jock was busy talking politics to a young Bulgarian there, and who had some reasonable English. And they were talking about, the ultras in football, which is soccer for them. They were talking about politics. They were talking about all kinds of things. And at about 1 a.m, they left the bar and they went to this square called Sant Nedelia Square, and they went to try to get some a phone card to charge up one of their phones. And while they were waiting at this kiosk, which is at the top corner of the square, the Bulgarian new friend could hear this chanting or singing coming from the metro station on the other side of the square. And he said, "Come on, we've got to get away from here. Those sound like football hooligans." And so they ran across the road, and most of them hid behind a wall that was there on the edge of a restaurant. Jock kept looking up to see what was going on, and he always said he saw this group, or a couple of them anyway, having some kind of argument with two what he thought were Roma, and then chase after the Roma and then attack one of the Roma. And at that point, he ran across the road, ran across the square and intervened. He's always said the attack then turned on him, and at that point he took the knife out of his pocket. It was a butterfly knife. He opened it up with both hands and raised it in the air. Across the road is a big hotel. It was the Sheraton. It was called the Sheraton at that stage, and it had car park attendants. Two of the car park attendants remember seeing a man who they what were worried was one of the guests at the Sheraton, because he was speaking English, shouting in English. They saw him holding this knife up in the air, saying, "Get away, get away." Jock has always said that he thought by bringing that knife out, it would frighten the probably 12 to 15 young men who were throwing punches and kicks at the Roma on the ground. He was standing over the Roma on the ground, the gypsy on the ground. Anyway, the fight sort of moved from that one corner near the metro station and moved back across to closer to where the kiosk was. And at that point, CCTV footage shows Jock being surrounded by the young men, and lumps of paver, so concrete, is being thrown at him. He always remembered being hit in the head. He fell to the ground. He thought his life was over. He told himself he had to get up. And after that, he doesn't remember anything. When I watch the CCTV, I can see him that he's hit in the head and that he gets up and he moves forward in probably a defensive manner, probably with the knife. You can't see that level of detail. And then he tries to escape and the group rushes after him. The defence never, ever led that because he never remembered it and the CCTV wasn't taken seriously. So they chase after him, and he has always said then he was turning around and around because they have him surrounded around and around with the knife outstretched, trying to keep a safety field around him. And they're still throwing lumps of pavement, and there's lots of bits of broken pavement wherever you go in Sofia, and they're throwing stuff at him. And at a certain point, one of the group backs away and falls on the ground, and we have to assume that's Andrei Monov. And he sustains a knife wound under his armpit, which slides between two ribs and goes into his heart, and he dies later on the way to the ambulance. But Jock at that point said that he was calling out, "Police, police, help, police, police." You can't hear any audio on CCTV, but certainly two guards, probably from the bank that's not far away, come, and the group is still trying to get at Jock, and the guards hold them at bay. And Jock, has held himself to the ground with his arms outstretched, and at that point he sees the knife, and he sees he's got blood on it, and he goes, "Oh my God, what has happened?" That's his account. But you see in the CCTV, he's lying on the ground and his arms are outstretched. And then police are called, police take him away, the ambulance leaves with Andrei Monov, and Jock is taken to a police station, and he's never, until the last couple of weeks, he's been incarcerated, fully incarcerated.
And until reading your book, I was under the impression that Jock had a violent history. a history of even knife crime. I had this idea in the back of my mind that at some stage during the process we'd learned that he presents as a gentle guy, but he's actually got some kind of history of knife violence. Where does that come from?
Well, firstly, everybody will have, anyone who has known Jock through school and through rowing, for example, or through social life on the North Shore of Sydney will have their own version of what kind of person Jock is or isn't, of course.
Of all of us, though, right? I mean, if any of us is put through this level of scrutiny, can you imagine how many versions of us would come out? But
absolutely and undoubtedly, and he's not just your run-of-the-mill person. No. But several days after he was arrested, an article appeared in the Daily Telegraph, the Sydney version of the News Limited papers, and it was an allegation by two men, one who used his full name and the other who just used his first name. And they alleged that Jock had attacked them at a party several years before in Chatswood, so in a suburb in Sydney, and that they'd been just going about their business at this party and suddenly he attacked them with a knife and that they'd gone to hospital with a knife. And that article went straight from the Daily Telegraph and newspaper stands in Sydney to the prosecutor's file, and then ultimately when Jock's trial began, into the court case. And it wasn't admitted officially as evidence, but it was there in the court file, and it has played a part in discussions about Jock's guilt or innocence ever since. That's one uncorroborated set of allegations published by a newspaper with devastating consequences. The truth may lie anywhere, but the bottom line fact is that Interpol says Jock has no convictions in Australia or anywhere else he's been. When I did an FOI to police, they said, yes, there was an incident on the date you're saying. No, Jock wasn't charged. No, Jock wasn't arrested. Many people were questioned and a perpetrator hasn't been found. So that's where it lies. The other thing I discovered was it wasn't just these two. When I questioned him about it, he says Jock appeared suddenly. He came because his brother said there were gate crashers coming. So he appeared on the scene at his brother's friend's party because there were these gate crashers, among them those who have levelled the allegation. And he saw his brother's friend in strife, and he picked him up and took him to safety, and he called the ambulance, so says the friend. So look, that party, what happened, what didn't happen, whether this was some sort of rivalry between different groups on the North Shore with 19-year-olds, who knows? Bottom line is Jock was a clean skin officially when it comes to charges.
I was horrified at how readily I had factored that into my understanding of him and the case, and how easily those stories enter the zeitgeist.
And then when something happens, because I've worked for a newspaper organisation, and when something happens, you've got to get any angle you can on that story. So you're looking, and stuff does get published pretty easily, and probably worse now than back in 2007. You can just make things so much worse for people.
And I think as journalists we all have to be mindful of that. When you're in a country where it's our legal system, where judges are a bit more separated from the investigation, which is not the case in Bulgaria. Their system is what's known as the inquisitorial system. And so the judge is like an investigator as well as, what we know as a judge, and will look at everything, not just what's admissible. But in any event, if someone is about to, or is now facing very serious charges, to throw things in from out of left field, which I can see as a journalist would be interesting material. Is there a backstory here? Is there a precedent here? Have they done this before? Yeah, it's a very dodgy thing. But now Jock Palfreeman is back in the news and people want to look at all different angles of him, and I understand that. As once upon a time a news reporter, I would want to do the same. So you want to go behind the name. You want to develop a sense of who that person was.
Well, particularly if he's being portrayed as this ultimate heroic character.
Yeah, true.
But so if there is someone else saying to you, no, this is a man who has a history of knife violence, that's a very interesting angle to follow up if there is proof of it.
I don't think, at the end of 2007, start of 2008, I don't think people saw him as a hero. I think people, for a long time after that too, say, an Australian brought out a knife? Are you kidding?
And he was quite, thinking of him when you're describing of him waving that knife around with people who, were they soccer hooligans? Because that's pretty brave, because soccer hooligans or people of that ilk don't really have that much fear,
I'll tell you my
they?
question, Belinda, and you know Jock and his family. My question, the more I read about him and learn about him, is, to me, he sounds like an ADHD guy or...
Yeah. People ask me that all the time.
Is he on the spectrum? Is he...
I don't think he's a spectrum dweller at all.
Spectrum dweller. That's a beautiful way
really
of saying
good.
it. Yes.
Yeah.
Anything like that?
I think his father describes him as spontaneous and impulsive. I think those, are appropriate words. But I think the thing when I first talked to Simon, and then Simon agreed to meet with me. He was very reluctant after that Daily Telegraph, after the incident of a newspaper bringing out these allegations and it having gone immediately into a court file and so forth. He was wary about talking to any journalist. So when Simon did agree to meet me, he showed me, because I wanted to understand who is this man, your son. So he showed me the report written by a Bulgarian court-appointed panel of psychiatrists and psychologists. And later I went and interviewed the psychiatrist and one of the psychologists on that panel. Their expert evidence to the Bulgarian court was that Jock was not violent by nature. He was spontaneous, he was impulsive. The overriding character trait that he had was he was driven by a sense of social justice. And when you meet Jock, and everyone, of course, will form their own opinion. Since 2009, when I first went to the prison, I've had lots of arguments over politics at the moment, over history, over... what train is the best one to get from Turkey to Sofia? I mean, what really comes across at you is that even now, even after being locked away for 11, nearly 12 years, he is like a burst of energy. He's a tall fellow. He'll laugh a lot. He doesn't force himself on you in terms of an argument, but he prosecutes his argument with a vivaciousness and an energy that both energises you, the listener, makes you have to think really fast to keep up with it, and it gives you a sense of a life source. He just grasps life by the jugular and gives it a good shake and gets the most out of every moment and believes in the moment. Yes, that's a fair description.
And there's plenty of young guys like that who, go travelling and they're just...
They hang out with people.
Yeah, because you meet so many people when you go overseas and you're just in the moment and you don't really think of any consequences.
And, well, I think first of all, Jock he won't go looking at architecture, right? So when I travel, I've always loved looking... I learn about the people in a place by looking at the architecture. He will just go and find someone in an airport, someone on the street to talk to. He likes meeting and being with people. He is absolutely a people person. That's still what's motivating him. The other thing that drives him is, is doing the right thing. Now, is he misguided on some ways that he goes about things? Many will say yes. Was it misguided thinking that pulling out a knife was going to frighten people away? Many will say yes. 12
years in a Bulgarian prison says yes, unfortunately.
Well, a dead person says yes.
Yeah, you're right.
Did it haunt Jock? It's another question that I'm often asked. Does he feel any remorse? When I first started interviewing him, he talked of this recurring inability to lie on his side or on his stomach because he could hear his heart beating and he couldn't bear that because he couldn't bear the idea that he might have been responsible for putting a knife into someone's heart. He couldn't bear that idea that someone had died. The other thing he couldn't bear was thinking about, and he mulled over and over and over it, that a family, he knew how much his parents loved him, that a family had lost their child and that a person's life had been snuffed out. That speaks to me of remorse. Did he remember at the time having, that he was the one who put a knife in between somebody's two ribs? No. And when I come to look at that CCTV footage, I can see that he has just tried to escape a group. However much he may or may not have been responsible for things escalating or not escalating, at that moment he'd been knocked out, he'd got up, he'd tried to escape from the group had chased after him, and he's then in a fight for his life. I now, once I saw that footage in 2012, having examined all the court file, having interviewed so many of the witnesses, I'm quite sure he was in a flight mode, and he was just trying to survive. And if his knife was the knife that intersected with the victim, it's very, very likely in the swirl of all that activity that he would have no idea. But did he feel a horror that he might have been the one who inflicted that wound? Absolutely. Would he say that now? Probably not. 11 and a half years have followed, and a lot of stuff has happened since then that has made all his family angry about the young men who were there that night, the young man who died, and the young man who died's family. Also, he spent 11 and a half years in prison where it would do you no good to sit day in, day out feeling full of remorse, particularly no good showing that you were weeping with remorse day in, day out. I don't think you'd have an easy ride in prison.
Can you give us some context around the ethnic tensions that were happening in Bulgaria at the time with the Roma community? There was some build-up, wasn't there?
Across Europe, Roma, otherwise known as gypsies, have been thought of as pickpockets and beggars and a scourge of some sort. We've seen France try to ship the Roma out of France, ship them back to wherever they may have come from, often to Bulgaria. We've seen attacks on Roma, we've seen Roma ghettos bulldozed down, lots of things like that. 2007, when this saga began, yes, the Roma were very much a despised minority group. Not by everybody, of course not by everybody. And I think they're still a minority group discriminated against by, if you like, prejudice and preconception. There's still often very poor people in that group. Yes, there may well be pickpockets. Yes, lots of people have stories of that, but lots of people have stories of pickpockets from people of all persuasions.
Yes. I mean, thousands of years of persecution, but there was quite a bit of tension in that specific community around that time that I think may have led Jock to take what was happening really seriously in that moment.
Before Jock left to go back to Britain, he'd been at a rock concert in the mountains, and a Roma man called Simo, whom I've met, was attacked by a group of skinheads. And Jock had befriended Simo earlier in the day. Suddenly Simo appeared at his tent and said, "They're still after me, they're after me." And Jock hid him in the tent somehow. And then once the skinheads were roaming around trying to find him after knifing him in the foot. And then once they'd gone past that tent, Jock's tent, Jock put Simo on the back of his motorbike and drove him out of the festival area to safety. And Simo has remained forever grateful to Jock. So Jock had seen firsthand the kind of attacks on gypsies or Roma, and had felt repulsed by that.
I lived in London for a long time, and the traveller population was certainly always controversial. There were towns that were petitioning the council to get traveller communities off land, and I was a teacher for a while, and the traveller students, hugely disadvantaged, and also hugely, even amongst other children who were new to the UK, they were like the most persecuted in the pecking order. They really are almost the most, I think, denigrated group of people in Europe, I think.
Yeah, that's my sense too.
Yeah.
That is my sense. And it was something that really struck me, perhaps that partially that drew me to this whole story, was when I was 19, I saw an ad in a country fair for position wanted selling sweets, and it was with a group of Roma or travellers. And so I travelled with them all around, up and down Britain. I slept in the van where we sold the sweets out of, and wherever we went, the owners of this particular business, their children would run ahead and tell the other travellers, "It's okay, she's a traveller, she's one of us." So there's a wariness on both sides, I think. But they were the outliers, and they were actively discriminated against by people in Britain. That's for sure. I still yes, it's somewhat like Aboriginal people have been here as well.
I know, isn't it fascinating that we are so startled by these sorts of things when we see them in other places, and somehow we don't manage to relate them to our own country and how relatable they actually are to situations in our own country.
Jock, almost when you describe how he helped Simo at the rock concert get away from these skinheads, he's almost coming across like a folk hero.
I think back in 2007 or 2005, 6, 7, I don't know that he would have been seen as a folk hero. He was loved by those he hung out with and those he befriended. I very much can see that. And then certainly after the incident on December 28th, 2007, he was cast in the Bulgarian media as a monster, and the father of the young man who died will still call him a monster, and one can understand to absolutely why the father would cast him as that.
You found an interesting article written by Andrei Monov's father, Hristo. What's his occupation? Is he a psychologist, and he's also somewhat of a media person. He often comments in the media on issues around youth violence, actually. And before his son was murdered, he wrote an article in the media about violence in society, and specifically about violence against Roma. He said tragedies like this are inevitable because young ethnic Bulgarian men working hard to get ahead were understandably sick of seeing gypsies on welfare driving their stinking horse-drawn carts on the streets of a European capital where the ethnic Bulgarians hoped one day to drive their nice cars. So that gives us an impression of the way Andrei Monov was raised, rightly or wrongly. That gives me an impression of the way the young man was raised. And at his funeral, there were certain notable men from government and from the legal profession present.
Undoubtedly, Hristo Monov, the father of the young man who died, and his wife, Aksenia Monova, who's a notary, a lawyer, undoubtedly they were well connected. After I started my research, it was found that Hristo Monov had been an informer during the communist time. That came out because after the incident, he became a politician with the party called BSP, that's like the Socialist Party, and that has lots of people who came out of the communist, if you like, regime, and are often seen as the ones who grabbed assets, either gave them to their mates who became the oligarchs or profited themselves from it. So there's no goodies. There's very few goodies in politics there.
Anywhere, some may argue. But
or anywhere, somewhere, some may argue. But he wasn't just, they weren't just your run-of-the-mill family. It's a small country and they were well connected, undoubtedly so. Did that set in place a whole trail of corruption that undid the defence case? That's harder to prove. It is easy to say that things either through ignorance on the part of the police, stupidity bumbling on the part of police, or through a determination that Jock was always going to be the guilty one and no other version of events would be entertained. That certainly happened.
Do you think it could be a combination of endemic racism in the community and the fact that the victim's family is very well connected? That's a pretty difficult combination to fight.
I think that I think in Bulgaria at that time, and I think even possibly still now, to have this picture painted of a foreigner come and take out the flower of Bulgarian youth, a young law student who comes from a good family, not some numbknuckle who comes from the street or something like that, comes from a good family, and it's a foreigner who takes him out. It tugs at the heartstrings of nationalism, and there is a big element of nationalism, and that plays out in all parts of politics and the judiciary and every other aspect of society. Not for all Bulgarians, of course, but there is a flank for which that's a very key thing. So Jock was a foreigner. He was saying he was going to rescue a gypsy, as the bail judge said to me. That was an unbelievable story. Like, who in their right mind would rescue a Roma, a gypsy? She said that quite kind of, outrightly. And the victim comes from a, respected family. Nothing. I mean, it was always going to be an uphill battle.
It's like the worst scenario.
The worst scenario.
That's it. It's very hard to fight. Jock Palfreeman hasn't exactly endeared himself to the Bulgarian government during his time in prison. We'll hear more about that after the break. Coming up on Australian True Crime, Belinda explains why Jock's parole is different to everyone else's parole in Bulgaria and why he's still not home. But first, we tend to hear a lot about the living conditions of Australian prisoners in Asian prisons, like Kerabakan, for example, in Bali. But we don't know a lot about Bulgarian prisons. Belinda's been inside and she describes it to us.
For most of the time, for other than the last 2 years, he's been in the high security prison called Sofia Central Prison. And it's different from the prison in Indonesia. It's possibly more akin to a prison I went to recently in Cambodia, where an Australian woman called Yoshe Taylor was kept. But yes, it's a crumbling stone building, electrical wires all hanging out everywhere, power sockets hanging out. The food comes by on a trolley for foreigners, and it's half a piece of liver once a week. It's that kind of thing. It's no hot water half the time, no cold water half the time. No, it's a long way from something you would expect in the European Union. It's a long way from that. And Bulgarian prisons and the treatment of prisoners have been roundly condemned by agencies across Europe and elsewhere in the world.
And he would be in with some very seriously dangerous kind of people. And I imagine going in as a young man as he was, would be terrifying. And I always think of his story as a parent and how, like, this would be my worst nightmare.
As the book suggests, yes.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. It was perfect.
He had to learn very fast how to survive in prison, and he had to figure pretty quickly that if you walked around looking meek and mild, you would be targeted as a victim and you'd become one. So much better to lead from the front foot, and that is in keeping with his character anyway. But I've no doubt that he sorted some people out who were being bullies. I've no doubt about that. I've no doubt that he was a retiring person on that level, but that's the way to survive. And as a parent, all you would do is fear that you would get another phone call and it would be that your son's coming home in a body bag.
Yes.
And that was the Palfreeman, that was Simon Palfreeman's nightly dread as he tried to go to sleep, that phone would ring and it would be the worst.
And he is in so many ways Jock's opposite, isn't he? I mean, you write about during the court case, their disagreements in how to handle so many things, because Simon is so retiring and his attitude is, let's take our time, let's go slower, let's not do anything that will come back later to haunt us. And Jock was sort of saying, go harder, hire us an investigator, let's prove this, let's prove that, let's find evidence. So much more energetic, is always the word. What can you tell us about that relationship, and how has that relationship coped over the years of imprisonment?
That was one of the things that really drew me also to this story. I wanted to watch what a father-son relationship would look like put under so much pressure. For the father trying to work out what on earth happened, and for the son in this case to work out how to deal with prison as well as how to find evidence, then try to work out how best to argue the case, to deal with court and all of those things, with money, with everything. They were always going to argue. Anybody would argue. Any child and parent or husband and wife in that situation would argue. It would tear most relationships apart. Dr. Simon Palfreeman is a pathologist by trade. He is, quietly spoken, likes to keep lists, likes to feel that he's understood every element of anything he's talking about before he says it. Jock left school at the end of year 12 and had been travelling the world and is a burst of energy. They approach things differently. Simon may agonise over what Jock is or isn't doing or what he's saying or not saying, but he now says it's up to Jock what he wants to do, and Jock needs to be listened to. Not because Jock was always right, but because Jock has very definite views and has an insight that perhaps people here, his family here, don't have to what's going on.
I'm sure he's an expert now, having started the
Bulgarian Prisoners Rehabilitation Association.
Yeah, so that's an incredible achievement to have started that organisation in a country that I'm sure was not, or a legal system that I'm sure was not supportive of starting an organisation like that.
So when all of Jock's court case had finished, so his trial finished and he was convicted of murder with hooliganism and attempted murder in 2009, then he appealed that in 2010, and then he went down on that and then appealed to the highest court in 2011. So in the lead up to 2011, Jock and some other prisoners, particularly a fellow with a life sentence, so who had nothing to lose, they'd started talking about corruption in the prison, bad things being done by prison authorities to prisoners undeservingly, and they started talking about setting up something like a union. In 2012, a big human rights organisation helped Jock take that proposal to a Bulgarian court and have it officially listed as an NGO. And that was a major success. The human rights organisation tic-tacked with Jock and some of the other members of Jock's association and gathered from them, what were some examples, egregious examples of, abuse in Sofia Central Prison, but also because they would hear of abuse elsewhere. And together, the association, so Jock, and this human rights group called the Bulgaria Helsinki Committee, took cases of prisoners other than Jock to the European Court of Human Rights and had a number of wins. And that's been that's driven Jock ever since.
Yeah,
and that's still driving him. And for a while in 2015, there was this interlude with a reformist justice minister in Bulgaria and a reformist deputy justice minister, which is the person in charge of prisons. And they went to see Jock and the association in prison to seek their views. A European Commission group looking at the problems in Bulgarian prisons, it sought a report by Jock and the association into what he saw as the problems in the prison. And unfortunately, that report was then passed on to the prison minister, the deputy justice minister, who comes from a far-right party. And almost immediately, Jock was given all these punishments for seemingly, nothing, trumped-up punishments almost, if not completely trumped up. And the message there was very clear. You give us a bad rap, you keep meddling the way you're doing, and we will see you never get parole. Because if you have a whole list of punishments, you've been ticked off in prison, of course you can't get parole.
What's the political situation in Bulgaria right now? Like, who is the party in power?
It's a more right-wing party than the one I was talking about, the Socialist Party. It's a more right-wing party called GERB, G-E-R-B, or known as GERB. But it's in power only with the help of a far-right party called VRMO, an extremist party, an extremist nationalist party. And in Bulgaria now, and has been for some time, there is this tension between those who want to embrace being part of the European Union, and Bulgaria became a member state in 2007, the year Jock was arrested. So those who want to embrace being a member of the European state want to fulfil the requirements to be a member state, and that is to have a justice system that ticks over, according to European expectations. And those who really would rather stay part of the Soviet model, which is like their old days, their old guard would think that way. And so the extreme right is in that camp. The Prosecutor General, I think it's pretty well felt, is in that camp. But there are reformist politicians, they're not in power. There are reformist judges, and there are reformist lawyers and reformist, people generally, and there's this clash between the two. And there have been protests on the streets of Bulgaria, a very big one just in the last few days, about the election of the next Prosecutor General, who was anointed by the current one, and with nobody else being able to run against him. So it was a done deal. And he seems to have the same politics. He's even more hardline, if you like. So their system at the moment is that this extreme far-right party has a seat at the table, a very important seat at the table when it comes to justice issues and when it comes to Jock, and that's the Deputy Justice position in charge of prisons.
So what's your sense of what will happen then? He's in this really strange limbo land where on one hand he has parole, which is contingent on his leaving Bulgaria. On the other hand, though, there's this very special law has been brought in that he must not leave Bulgaria.
Yeah, so just to back up on that, in July this year, Jock applied for parole. He was eligible to apply for parole at 10 years. He'd already served 11 years. He applied for parole and he didn't get it. And the prison, the head of the prison and the prison minister, the Deputy Justice Minister, all argued, he wasn't rehabilitated enough, he'd been a bad boy in prison and so forth. Then in September, he appealed it. It was a new panel of judges in a higher court, the appeal court. And in a sense, he was just lucky. He got 3 so-called reformist judges. And they said, we are granting you parole, but you must leave Bulgaria and not come back for 5 years. And you must leave as soon as you have the paperwork. So the next day, he was taken out of prison and taken to a detention centre because he didn't have a passport. His passport had expired and so forth. And within 2 days, Australia got him a passport, but within that period, the far right was mounting protests. The father of the young man who died, the parents of the young man who died, petitioned the Prosecutor General and said, don't let him leave the country, put him back in prison. The Prosecutor General then made this unprecedented appeal to an even higher court. It wasn't the changing of a law. It's never happened before. Right. And many would say it was illegal because the court that granted Jock parole is a final court. There is no if, buts or maybes after it makes a decision. That's the law. So Jock stayed in this detention centre for a month, and people were increasingly up in arms. People who might have thought of Jock as a monster before were up in arms because it wasn't about Jock anymore. It was about ordinary Bulgarians. Yeah. The rule of law is not applying in this country. And if they'll do it to him, a foreigner who's at least got some kind of embassy backing behind him, what will happen to us? We could be picked up off the street, given a trumped-up charge and tossed in a prison or put into a detention centre. There's no rule of law. And that's really what's got to Bulgarians now. And that's in a sense where he's a lightning rod. It's not about whether he was guilty or innocent, although many Bulgarians, judges and lawyers and prosecutors who I spoke to when I was there a fortnight ago, many of them were questioning whether indeed his conviction was sound, whether he was guilty or innocent. But overridingly, it's a bigger thing. He's become a symbol. What's happening to him in this limbo, this bizarre illegal limbo that he's in, where he's been directed to leave the country on parole and yet he's suddenly not being allowed to leave the country, that's created this flashpoint for concerns Bulgarians already have about the rule of law in their country. And if Bulgaria is found to be not following its own laws, then Europe can censor it. To be a member state in the European Union, one of the requirements is that you follow, that countries, member states, follow their own rule of law. So finally, DFAT, or the Australian Foreign Minister, did intervene loudly and asked the European Commission to intervene, to say, excuse me, you're not following the rules. You're not allowed to be part of our club and not follow your own rules. That, of course, gets even more pushback from nationalists who don't want Europe.
Yeah, they don't want to be told
around.
What to do.
No.
Well, look at Brexit. I mean...
Well, look, England did the same thing.
Belinda's book about the Palfreeman story is called Every Parent's Nightmare. It's available now. There are links to her website and to the Australian Story episode on ABC iView in the show notes to this podcast and on our Facebook page. Thank you for downloading this episode of Australian True Crime. We'll be back next week.